The bells of Westminster tolled with a solemn rhythm on an August morning in 1422, echoing over the Thames and through the narrow streets of London. The sound carried sorrow and disbelief. The people of England had lost their warrior king, Henry V, the hero of Agincourt, the man who had bent France to his sword. His death at the age of 35 felt like the end of a dream that had barely begun. In the great abbey, the air was heavy with incense and grief. Knights who had marched beside him in mud and rain knelt in silence, their armor catching the glow of candles. They remembered the battlefields where they had followed him, the confidence that radiated from him, the voice that turned fear into courage. At Agincourt, against all odds, the small English army had triumphed over a host far greater. It was a victory that had reshaped not only the map of France, but the very soul of England. Henry V had been more than a soldier. He had been a vision of what kingship could be. Disciplined, just, devout, and resolute. He had restored dignity to the crown and pride to a weary nation. He believed that God had chosen him to unite two realms and to bring order out of chaos. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, had crowned that ambition, naming him heir to the throne of France and husband to Princess Catherine of Valois. It was a triumph of will, a peace written in his favor. Yet even at the height of his power, his destiny remained unfinished. When the fever took him during his campaign in France, he left behind not an empire, but a fragile inheritance. His son, Henry VI, was an infant barely 9 months old. 2 kingdoms bowed before a child who could not yet speak. The image of the queen cradling her baby as the funeral procession moved through the streets lingered in every mind. It seemed a vision sent by Providence and warning at once, a realm built on valor, now dependent on innocence. In the months that followed, England seemed to hold its breath. The throne stood empty, its authority divided between 2 uncles of the young king, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and John, Duke of Bedford. Gloucester ruled in England, passionate and impulsive, while Bedford governed in France, calm and calculating. Between them stretched not only the Channel, but a growing tension that mirrored the uncertainty of the age. The royal council was a theater of rivalry. Cardinal Beaufort, the cautious statesman, argued for peace and diplomacy. Gloucester, proud and defiant, demanded that England continue the war and preserve the conquests Henry V had won. The child's name became the banner of both factions. Each claimed to act in the king's interest, yet both sought to shape the kingdom in their own image. Across the realm, people prayed for the boy they called their hope and their miracle. In the churches, they sang hymns for Henry, King of England and of France. Yet beneath the prayers ran a quiet fear. The victories in France had brought glory but also debt, and the cost of empire grew heavier with each passing year. Taxes rose, soldiers went unpaid, and the sense of triumph began to fade into fatigue. Ceremony became the substitute for leadership. The twin banners of England and France hung side by side in Westminster, symbols of unity that hid a growing fracture. The lion and the lilies fluttered together in the same wind, but the alliance they represented existed only in ritual. Beneath the surface, distrust and division deepened. The nobles argued, the church interfered, and the queen, a foreigner still mourning her husband, found herself isolated in a court that viewed her with suspicion. It was in this uneasy peace that Catherine of Valois, lonely and young, sought companionship with a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor. Their quiet union, born of affection rather than politics, would one day give rise to a new royal house, though few then could imagine it. For the moment, it only added another layer of tension to an already fractious realm. England itself seemed adrift. The memory of Henry V's glory lingered like sunlight after dusk, but the air had grown colder. The soldiers who once carried his banner now roamed the countryside as beggars or bandits. The war that had filled England's coffers was draining them dry. The victories that had defined a generation were becoming ghosts. In the midst of this uncertain time, the child who was king grew surrounded by tutors, priests, and courtiers. His world was one of books, not battlefields. He was taught Latin and scripture, not strategy or arms. His lessons emphasized mercy, humility, and devotion to God. They were virtues fit for a saint, not for a ruler of men. Those who looked into his gentle eyes saw kindness, but not command. He seemed destined to heal souls, not to lead armies. The regency endured year after year, and the boy's presence became more symbolic than real. England functioned through custom and inertia, the machinery of governance running on habit rather than purpose. Yet beyond the Channel, France was stirring. The English held vast territories there, but the spirit of resistance was rising. From the marshes of Normandy to the heart of the Loire, whispers spread of deliverance, of divine favor returning to the French crown. The dream of English dominion was beginning to crack. In 1429, the child who had once been a symbol of uncertainty became the centerpiece of a grand ceremony. At Westminster Abbey, beneath a ceiling gilded with angels, Henry was crowned King of England. The procession dazzled the eye. Bishops in gold, nobles in crimson, choirs echoing through the nave. To the people watching, it was both a celebration and a reassurance. Their king had come of age, and England's destiny would continue. But the boy himself seemed distant from the pageantry. He moved with grace but without energy, repeating the words placed before him, his expression serene and unreadable. The heavy crown rested upon his small head like a burden rather than a prize. The applause that filled the abbey was not for him, as he was, but for the memory of what his father had been. 2 years later, in 1431, he was crowned again, this time in Paris, as King of France. The journey across the sea was long and uncertain, the welcome in France colder than expected. Inside the great cathedral of Notre Dame, the ceremony was grand, but uneasy. The nobles bowed, the choirs sang. Yet even those present sensed the contradiction. The child wore 2 crowns, but neither truly fit. The lilies of France and the lions of England gleamed upon his robes, yet they did not blend. Those who knew Henry spoke of his gentleness, his compassion, his unshakable piety. He spent long hours in prayer, gave generously to the poor, and treated even his enemies with kindness. He founded colleges that would outlive him, places where learning could flourish beyond the reach of war. His soul seemed untouched by the corruption that surrounded him. But in a kingdom that needed strength, his virtues became his weakness. He was not blind to suffering, only powerless against it. He hated conflict and sought harmony, believing that goodwill could bridge every divide. Yet every act of mercy made him seem less decisive. Every moment of reflection looked like hesitation. Those who ruled in his name began to use his passivity for their own ends. The nobles carved out influence, the clergy maneuvered for favor, and the queen he would one day marry, Margaret of Anjou, would wield the power he lacked. In those early years, however, the cracks were still thin, visible only to those who knew where to look. The Duke of Bedford struggled to maintain control in France, while Gloucester and Beaufort quarreled in London. Behind the facade of unity, mistrust spread. The dream of Henry V, one crown for 2 kingdoms, was beginning to fade into illusion. Meanwhile, the boy king prayed. Chroniclers described him as serene, even saintly. But to others he seemed detached from the world. He would listen quietly while his counselors debated war and taxation, then speak softly of charity, forgiveness, or divine justice. It was said that he preferred the company of monks to soldiers, and the music of hymns to the noise of politics. To those who served him, he appeared holy. To those who opposed him, hopeless. Years later, men would look back on his reign and see a line drawn in shadow between greatness and decline. He was the hinge on which 2 centuries turned, the son of conquest, the father of civil war. His father had ruled through strength, his son would rule through faith. But faith without force is a fragile bond. On a winter evening, in the quiet of Windsor's chapel, the young king stood before the altar of St. George. The candles flickered in the still air. The statue of the saint towered above him, sword raised in triumph. Henry bowed deeply, his lips moving in prayer. The light touched his face, soft and pale, and for a moment it seemed as if he and the figure above were one, a warrior of heaven and a child of earth, bound by destiny, yet divided by nature. Outside, the wind carried the echo of bells from distant villages. Across the sea, in France, garrisons still held out, but the tide was already turning. The peace Henry V had secured through courage was slipping away through inaction. The boy, who had been crowned in gold and incense, stood alone beneath the shadow of greatness. The crown upon his head gleamed with all the promise of empire, yet it pressed heavily, too heavy for a head so young, too heavy for a heart so mild. In that moment, beneath the glow of candles and the cold breath of winter, England's future trembled, not in the clash of armies, but in the silence of a king who did not yet know that destiny had already chosen its course. And so began the reign of Henry VI, born to rule 2 kingdoms, yet destined to lose them both, not through malice or betrayal, but through the gentlest and most human of all frailties, the heart too kind to command. France, by the late 1420s, was a land divided against itself. One half bowed to the rule of England's young king Henry VI. The other still clung to the fading claim of Charles, the Dauphin of Valois, a prince without a crown, wandering among loyal towns south of the Loire. The long war had drained both sides. Cities were scarred, fields lay empty, and the people had grown used to uncertainty as though it were a season that never ended. England's banners still flew over Paris, Normandy, and much of the north. Yet even there, the loyalty was thin, bought with coin and guarded by weary garrisons. France seemed broken, a realm where hope had forgotten its language. And then, in the winter of 1428, word began to spread, quietly at first, carried from village to village. Somewhere in the hills of Lorraine, they said, a young woman claimed to hear voices from heaven. Her name was Jean. She was the daughter of a farmer, a girl who had never seen battle, never learned to read or write. Yet she spoke with a certainty that unnerved scholars and comforted soldiers. She said that God had chosen her to deliver France. To those who first met her, she seemed both ordinary and extraordinary, barefoot, with rough hands and calm eyes that held an impossible conviction. She spoke of angels, of saints, of destiny. Many dismissed her as a dreamer. But others, weary of nobles who spoke of treaties while their villages burned, saw in her a different kind of authority, one not granted by bloodline or title, but by faith. At first, the Dauphin's court hesitated. His advisers feared embarrassment, perhaps even heresy. Yet desperation breeds belief. When Jean arrived at Chinon in 1429, dressed in simple black and asking for an audience, the prince agreed to see her. The hall was crowded with courtiers who whispered and laughed. Jeanne entered without fear. She bowed, not to the man they presented as the Dauphin, but to another, the true Charles, disguised among his nobles. It was said that she had recognized him by divine insight. Whatever the truth, and something changed that day. The Dauphin, hesitant and uncertain, saw in her an energy that had long escaped him. She spoke of banners and victory, of reclaiming his rightful crown. She asked for armor, a sword, and permission to lead an army to relieve the besieged city of Orléans. Against all reason, he granted it. Her arrival at Orléans was unlike anything the war had yet seen. The city had been surrounded for months by English forces, their towers and fortifications pressing in like a tightening hand. The people were starving, their courage fading. Then, one April morning, a column appeared on the horizon, soldiers carrying a white banner embroidered with the names of Jesus and Mary. At its front rode Jeanne, dressed in shining armor, her banner rippling in the wind. Witnesses said that her presence transformed the city. Priests rang the bells, citizens filled the streets, and soldiers who had lost faith lifted their swords once more. She spoke to them not as a commander, but as a believer. Fight, she told them, and God will grant you victory. Her conviction spread like fire through the ranks. Even seasoned captains who had mocked her found themselves unable to resist her certainty. The days that followed were filled with thunder and smoke. From the ramparts, the people of Orléans watched as her banner moved through the haze, always at the front, never retreating. Wherever it appeared, the defenders seemed to find new strength. The English, long accustomed to facing professional armies, found themselves battling something less tangible and far more powerful, the idea that heaven itself fought for France. The chronicles tell that on the 8th of May, 1429, the siege was broken, the English lines fell back, the gates were opened, and the bells of Orléans rang through the night. Soldiers wept openly, shouting, "Vive la France!" The miracle had happened. A kingdom long asleep had awakened. For the Duke of Bedford, England's regent in France, the news struck like a thunderclap. His letters to London spoke of disbelief and frustration. How could a girl, a peasant, scarcely 17, undo years of conquest? Yet the truth was undeniable. The spell of English invincibility had been broken. France, once fractured, now rallied around a single vision, and that vision wore armor and carried a banner of white. Jeanne's victory was not only military but spiritual. She had given her country back its voice. Towns that had submitted to English rule began to waver. Priests preached of divine deliverance. Soldiers who had once fought for pay now fought for faith. The Dauphin, once hesitant, began to believe that perhaps he was indeed chosen to rule. But history rarely grants miracles without cost. Jeanne's triumph would soon draw envy and suspicion from those she had inspired. For now, though, the story burned bright. The story of a girl who had walked out of the silence of rural France and changed the course of nations. In the chronicles of that spring, the imagery is vivid. The smoke rising over the Loire, the clang of bells mixing with the rhythm of drums, the white banner waving above a crowd of exhausted men who suddenly believed again. To stand in that moment was to feel that destiny could turn, that the impossible could bend. Even now, centuries later, her name carries that same echo of renewal. It reminds us that conviction, pure, unshaken, and selfless, can ignite a people when armies and kings have failed. Her story endures not merely as legend, but as a reminder that history is not written only by those born to power, but by those who dare to believe they are called to something greater. And as we follow this tale of empires rising and falling, of faith standing against might, let her voice linger in the mind, the voice that said, France will live again. Because in every age, there comes a moment when courage must speak louder than fear. If you want to hear more stories like this, of kings and saints, of triumph born from despair, stay with this journey and listen as history breathes once more. That spring of 1429 marked not just a battle won, but a soul restored. The city of Orléans stood free again, its walls blackened but unbroken, its people singing beneath the same flag that had once seemed only a dream. And beneath that flag rode Jeanne, not a conqueror, but a messenger, her gaze fixed beyond the horizon, where the dawn of France was rising anew. The victory at Orléans did more than lift a siege. It changed the direction of history. What had seemed impossible only months before now felt inevitable. The people of France, long divided by fear and weariness, began to move, as if guided by one heartbeat. Villages that had lived under English banners quietly replaced them with the lilies of France. Priests spoke in their sermons of divine favor returning. Soldiers, once mercenaries for hire, now called themselves servants of God and the Dauphin. For Charles, the prince who had spent much of his life in uncertainty, the triumphs of 1429 gave him what years of diplomacy could not: legitimacy. He began to act like a king. The dream that Jeanne had promised him to see him crowned in Reims, the ancient city of French anointing, became his fixed star. For centuries, Reims had been the holy cradle of French monarchy, the place where kings received the oil of coronation, but it lay deep within enemy territory. To reach it would require more than courage. It would require faith in the destiny that Jeanne carried like a torch. In the summer of that year, the unlikely procession began. Through hostile lands and broken towns, Charles' army advanced. Jeanne rode near his banner, her white standard rising above the dust. Wherever they passed, towns opened their gates, inspired more by her presence than by the threat of arms. Troyes surrendered without bloodshed. Chalons welcomed them with bells. It was as if France itself was waking from a long fever. On July 17, 1429, the coronation finally took place. Inside the Cathedral of Reims, the light from the high windows fell like gold upon the gathered crowd. Charles knelt before the altar, and the archbishop anointed him with holy oil, the same rite that had sanctified his ancestors. As the choir sang, Jeanne stood beside the throne, her banner unfurled. To those who watched, the symbolism was unmistakable. The Dauphin had become Charles VII, and France had been reborn. The moment was electric, filled with both triumph and prophecy. The soldiers who had marched through ruin and doubt now wept openly, shouting, "Long live the King!" The people who filled the cathedral believed they were witnessing the turning of an age, a kingdom restored not by lineage alone, but by faith. Yet even in that brilliance, the shadow of reality remained. England still held Paris, Normandy, and most of the north. The coronation gave France its heart again, but not yet its body. Jane urged the new king to march immediately on Paris to finish what had begun. But the court hesitated. The cautious nobles, weary of miracles, sought negotiation rather than confrontation. They feared that the fire Jeanne carried could just as easily consume them. When the assault on Paris came that autumn, it was half-hearted. The army lacked unity, and the momentum that had carried them to Reims faltered. Jane herself was wounded outside the city walls, and the attack was called off. To her, it was a betrayal of purpose. To others, a return to prudence. France had regained its king, but it was already losing its miracle. Still, the balance of the war had shifted irreversibly. From that year onward, the English were no longer conquerors, but defenders. Their armies, once bold and disciplined, became cautious and stretched thin. The cost of occupation grew unbearable. In the towns they controlled, resentment simmered. Taxes rose to pay for garrisons, and local nobles began to weigh loyalty against survival. In London, Henry II's council struggled to maintain control over a distant empire it could no longer afford. The boy king, more interested in prayer than policy, offered little guidance. The burden of governance fell upon men like the Duke of Bedford, who served as regent in France. Bedford was capable, disciplined, and loyal to his brother's memory, but even he could not fight against the tide of fatigue and fortune. For a decade after Orléans, he fought to hold what remained of Henry I's conquests. His letters reveal a man aware of the slow erosion beneath his feet. Supplies dwindled, allies hesitated, and morale declined. England's enemies multiplied, not by battle, but by time. Then came 1435, the year everything changed. That summer, John, Duke of Bedford, died at Rouen. His passing was more than the death of a man. It was the end of England's unity in France. Without him, there was no figure capable of commanding both fear and respect among the English lords abroad. Almost at once, the alliance with Burgundy, the great northern power that had long bolstered England's position, began to crumble. The Treaty of Arras, signed in the same year, reconciled Burgundy with Charles VII. The Duke of Burgundy, once the steadfast ally of the English, now recognized the French king as his sovereign. The shift was seismic. With Burgundy's withdrawal, the English found themselves isolated, their supply lines fractured, their political foundation shaken. In Paris, the mood darkened. The English government, which had once ruled confidently from the city's palaces, began to fray. Bureaucrats argued, soldiers deserted, merchants whispered of revolt. The treasury ran dry. The population, weary of foreign rule, grew restless. French partisans moved through the alleys at night, spreading word of Charles' coronation, of a France rising again. The same city that had once crowned the English king now waited for its chance to welcome the French one back. Meanwhile, Charles VII, once timid and uncertain, was transforming. Freed from the shadow of doubt, he began to govern with quiet determination. He surrounded himself with capable advisors, men of reform rather than inheritance. The chaos of war had tempered him, and the faith Jeanne had inspired lingered in his decisions. Jeanne herself would soon fall into English hands, her fate sealed by fear and politics. But her influence endured. Even in captivity, her legend grew. To the French, she was the soul of the nation. To the English, an enigma they could not silence. As the 1430s drew to a close, France had not yet won the war, but it had reclaimed something more vital: belief. The people once again saw themselves as a nation, not as fragments under foreign crowns. From the fields of Champagne to the streets of Paris, that belief was becoming strength. By the time news of Bedford's death reached London, it was already too late to reverse the tide. The empire Henry I had forged with courage and discipline was dissolving in slow motion. What had begun as a march of conquest was ending as a retreat disguised as administration. In the great halls of Paris, where English banners still hung, dust gathered along the edges. The officials continued their duties, writing decrees and counting coins, but the echo of authority had faded. Outside, the murmur of French voices grew louder each night. The transformation was nearly complete. Within a few short years, the war that had once made England the master of France would become the struggle that defined its decline. The torch of destiny had passed from one hand to another, and no treaty, no army, no prayer could now return it. Thus, in the quiet years after the thunder of Orléans and reign, a truth settled over Europe that empires, like men, are not defeated only by enemies, but by the weight of their own exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, France found its resurrection. While France was stirring with renewed strength, England across the narrow sea was sinking into a quiet and uneasy slumber. The victories of Henry I had become the stuff of sermons and songs, distant as the echo of a golden age. The boy who had once been crowned in both Westminster and Paris was now a man, King Henry VI of England and of France, yet he seemed untouched by the urgency of the world he ruled. In London, the court had grown elegant and cautious. Ministers spoke in polished tones, scholars filled the libraries, and courtiers discussed theology more than policy. Henry himself found comfort not in the council chamber, but in the cloister. His days were shaped by prayer, contemplation, and charity. He loved the quiet rhythm of monastic life, the harmony of choir voices, the turning of sacred pages more than the clash of ideas or the burden of command. To him, the world was not a place to conquer, but to redeem. Those who came before him seeking direction often left with little more than a blessing. He was gentle in word, merciful in judgment, but uncertain in will. When reports arrived from France of garrisons falling, of villages reclaimed by Charles VII, of English captains pleading for reinforcements, Henry listened gravely, promised to pray for their safety, and returned to his devotions. To his admirers, he was a saint in royal robes. To his critics, he was a monk trapped on a throne. He built schools, supported scholars, and founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, institutions meant to enlighten souls long after his wars were forgotten. But kings are remembered less for what they build than for what they lose. By the early 1440s, the empire in France was unraveling. One by one, the English-held territories that had once been the pride of Henry I began to slip away. Normandy, Maine, and the great towns along the Loire all were under siege, not only by armies, but by time and neglect. The cost of holding France drained England's treasury and patience alike. Taxes rose, merchants grumbled, and soldiers went unpaid. The glory that had once united the realm now fed its discontent. In this climate of exhaustion, the royal council sought peace at any price. The man who embodied this hope was William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, a skilled diplomat but a dangerous courtier whose charm masked ambition. He convinced the king that reconciliation with Charles VII could save both crowns from ruin. It was a tempting vision, an end to war, a chance to heal, a dream of Christian unity. And so, in 1445, a marriage was arranged between Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, the spirited young niece of Charles VII. She was only 15, beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely proud. The union was meant to symbolize reconciliation between England and France. But beneath the ceremony lay compromise. As part of the secret negotiations, Henry's ministers agreed to return the province of Maine to France, a decision that would soon be seen as betrayal. When Margaret arrived in England, the court welcomed her with pageantry. London's streets bloomed with banners. Choirs sang hymns to peace. Henry met her with quiet admiration. He saw in her not just a bride, but the embodiment of his own longing for harmony. Margaret, however, was cut from a different cloth. She admired her husband's kindness, but soon realized that his gentleness left a void others would fill. Where Henry sought prayer, she sought action. At first, she tried to guide him gently, urging firmness where he offered forgiveness. But as years passed and the kingdom's fortunes declined, she became the power he could not be. Ministers and nobles gravitated toward her, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. Suffolk rose higher than ever, using the Queen's confidence to tighten his hold on the court. His policy of peace at any price became the official creed of the realm. Yet peace founded on weakness rarely endures. The Treaty of Tours, signed in the same year as the royal marriage, declared a truce with France. The English were weary enough to welcome it, but beneath the hymns of thanksgiving, bitterness spread. Veterans cursed the surrender of Maine. Merchants lamented the loss of markets, and the old soldiers of Henry V muttered that the kingdom was being undone by cowards in silk robes. The king seemed deaf to their anger. He rejoiced in the truce as though it were divine providence. He spent his days endowing chapels, visiting monasteries, and supporting the poor. At Windsor and Westminster, he held long hours of prayer for peace, even as peace itself was slipping through his fingers. His courtiers grew restless. England, once feared abroad, now seemed uncertain of itself at home. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Charles VII pressed his advantage. The French army, reformed and reinvigorated, recaptured towns with growing ease. Artillery and new tactics turned once proud English fortresses into relics. By 1449, Normandy, the jewel of England's empire, began to fall piece by piece. The Duke of Somerset, who had succeeded Bedford, proved indecisive. His soldiers fought bravely but without direction, waiting for orders that never came. In London, anger boiled over. The loss of Maine, followed by defeats in Normandy, destroyed Suffolk's credibility. The people demanded someone to blame. Rumors filled the streets. Whispers of corruption, of secret dealings with France, of betrayal within the court. Suffolk was eventually exiled, only to be captured at sea and executed by enraged sailors. The act was brutal and swift, but it could not undo what had been lost. Henry, devastated, retreated further into silence. He spoke of forgiveness, of the need to love even those who hated him. To his followers, these words sounded holy. To his enemies, hopeless. England was now divided between those who still believed in his piety and those who hungered for strength. Margaret, sensing the kingdom's drift, stepped forward as the voice of resolve. She gathered allies among the ambitious and the bold, men like Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and sought to defend her husband's authority by force, if necessary. Yet her assertiveness only deepened the fractures within the realm. To many, she became the symbol of foreign influence. To others, the only ruler England truly had. By the mid-1440s, the contrast between the two monarchs had become a portrait of England itself. Henry, contemplative and gentle, lost in visions of faith. Margaret, determined and political, wrestling with the harshness of reality. The peace he had desired was crumbling, and the war he feared was returning, this time not in France, but in his own kingdom. There is a story told by chroniclers that in those troubled years, Henry would often spend evenings alone in his study, surrounded by maps of France. By candlelight, he would trace the borders that once had been his father's glory. As reports arrived of yet another town lost, another fortress fallen, he would quietly fold the parchment, as if to hide the wound it showed. On his desk lay a worn Bible, its margins filled with notes in his delicate hand. Those who passed by his chamber at night said they could hear his voice, soft, steady, reading aloud from the Psalms. Outside, the world he ruled was breaking apart. Inside, the words he spoke seemed to belong to another realm entirely. And so, as France rose again from its ashes, England drifted toward its own decline, not with a cry, but with a prayer. The map of empire that had once glowed with ambition now faded like an old tapestry, frayed at the edges, pieces torn away, one by one. In the flicker of candlelight, the king read on, his shadow stretching across the parchment. A man of peace watching helplessly as the kingdom his father had conquered dissolved into silence. The 1440s drew England into a slow and quiet crisis, not a collapse of walls or armies, but a corrosion of trust. The loss of France had not yet been fully acknowledged, yet its shadow already hung over Westminster. Beneath the gilded ceilings of the royal palace, power was shifting, slipping away from the weak hands of a king and into those of the courtiers who whispered closest to him. Among them none shone brighter or darker than William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. Once a loyal servant of Henry V, he had risen through diplomacy rather than the sword. He was elegant, persuasive, and always calm in the presence of the king. To Henry VI, he appeared a model of loyalty and prudence, a man devoted to peace and the glory of God. But to the nobles who watched him from afar, Suffolk was something else, a shadow behind the throne, subtle, self-assured, and ambitious beyond measure. In the absence of strong leadership, Suffolk filled the vacuum with his charm and control. He had negotiated the king's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and used that connection to place himself at the center of royal favor. The queen admired his intelligence and his devotion to the crown. Together, they formed a partnership that ruled not by decree, but by persuasion. Ministers were replaced with Suffolk's allies, councils swayed by his voice. For years, decisions that shaped the kingdom were made not in the open light of the council chamber, but in quiet rooms, under his direction. Meanwhile, the realm he managed so carefully was beginning to crack. The debts of war continued to grow, and trade suffered from the loss of continental ports. In Parliament, murmurs of discontent rose. The Commons complained of endless taxation, of corruption within the king's household, and of a court that seemed deaf to the suffering of the people. Henry VI, ever gentle, refused to see the rot. To him, Suffolk was a faithful servant, maligned by jealous men. He believed that harmony could be restored through patience and prayer. But patience in politics is often mistaken for weakness. The nobles who had once rallied behind Henry V's banner now drifted into rival factions. Some aligned with Suffolk and the Queen, seeking influence through royal favor. Others began to look elsewhere, to Richard, Duke of York, the ambitious cousin whose lineage gave him a claim to the throne itself. In 1447, the death of Cardinal Henry Beaufort deepened the void. The cardinal had been both a stabilizing force and a rival to Gloucester, the king's uncle. His passing removed one of the last figures capable of balancing the competing powers within the realm. Without him, the factions grew bolder, and the peace that Henry VI cherished became little more than a word recited in prayer. Gloucester, the old champion of war and national pride, soon found himself isolated. He had long opposed Suffolk's policies, accusing him of betraying England through his diplomacy with France, but his influence waned and his enemies closed in. In 1447, during a parliament session in Bury St. Edmunds, Gloucester was arrested on charges of treason. Days later, he was found dead in his quarters. Officially, it was said that he had died of natural causes, but few believed it. To the public, his death became a symbol, proof that the realm's protectors were being silenced. With Gloucester gone and Beaufort buried, Suffolk stood unchallenged. His control over the king and queen seemed absolute. Yet the higher he rose, the more fragile his position became. Beyond the palace gates, the people murmured of corruption and betrayal. Pamphlets and rumors spread through London, accusing him of enriching himself, of mismanaging the treasury, of selling English lands for personal gain. Queen Margaret defended him fiercely. To her, Suffolk represented order. Amid chaos, the man who understood her language, her mind, and her mission, she was young but shrewd, aware that as a French-born queen, she would always be viewed with suspicion. The English nobility never fully accepted her. To many, she was a symbol of defeat, the living reminder of a peace signed in humiliation, yet she refused to retreat. She spoke in council with clarity and fire, arguing that a nation exhausted by war must rebuild, not rage. Her words, however, were twisted in the streets. Preachers thundered against foreign influence. Ballads mocked her accent, her pride, her closeness to Suffolk. For a people who had lost their glory abroad, it was easier to find enemies within. The economic strain grew harsher with each passing year. Taxes multiplied, the coinage weakened, and trade routes faltered. The crown borrowed heavily from merchants and lenders, but repayment never came. Farmers cursed the levies. Craftsmen closed their shops. In taverns and marketplaces, men whispered that the kingdom was being ruled not by its rightful king, but by flatterers and foreigners. Henry VI, hearing these complaints, responded not with anger, but sorrow. He issued proclamations urging honesty among officials, fairness among nobles, and mercy among debt collectors. He prayed for harmony, and for a brief moment, his sincerity softened hearts. But prayer could not fill empty granaries, nor repair the broken trust between crown and people. By 1450, discontent had spread like a slow fire through the countryside. The legend of Henry V still haunted the nation, the image of a king who had led from the front, who had spoken with strength and conviction. Henry VI was none of those things. He spoke softly, deferred easily, and saw conflict as a sin rather than a duty. To the people, his peace had become their burden. Even within the royal court, anxiety grew. Suffolk's dominance had begun to suffocate those around him. The Queen's favor could protect him only so long. The treasury was empty, the army unpaid, and reports from France were grim. One by one, the last strongholds began to fall. The same nobles who had once praised his diplomacy now whispered of treachery. In private, Suffolk sensed the storm gathering. He spoke often with the Queen, urging her to hold firm, to trust in the king's faith. But outside the palace walls, England was already turning against him. The common people blamed him for every loss, every tax, every humiliation. In his polished calm, they saw deceit. In his eloquence, manipulation. The court that had once gleamed with hope now seemed weighed down by fear. Every conversation hid an accusation, every alliance a threat. Margaret of Anjou, brilliant and resolute, stood in the center of it all, determined to preserve her husband's crown, yet surrounded by men who sought to use her cause for their own ends. And above them all, Henry II remained what he had always been, a man too kind for the age he ruled. He moved through his halls like a figure out of time, praying for peace as his realm fractured around him. The banners of his father's victories still hung in Westminster, faded and silent. And outside, the murmur of a restless nation grew louder, like the distant roll of thunder before the coming storm. By the mid-1440s, the dream of Henry IV's empire had become a fragile illusion, a ghost kept alive in ceremonies and titles, while the real ground beneath England's rule in France crumbled away. The Treaty of Tours, signed in 1444, had promised a new age of peace, but it was peace built on surrender. As part of its secret terms, England agreed to return the province of Maine to the French crown. To Suffolk and his supporters, the concession was a necessary sacrifice to end decades of ruinous war. To the rest of the realm, it was treason disguised as diplomacy. When the news reached England, outrage spread from the halls of Parliament to the narrow streets of London. The veterans of Henry I's campaigns called it betrayal. The merchants called it folly. The common people whispered that their king had sold his father's victories for a French bride's smile. Ballads mocked the court, sermons condemned its weakness, and the once revered phrase, "peace at any price," began to sound like a curse. Suffolk, however, stood firm beside the Queen. He argued that peace would restore trade and heal the realm. Henry VI, desperate to believe, clung to Suffolk's counsel and to Margaret's conviction. For a brief moment, it seemed that the truce might hold. The armies rested, the ports reopened, and the treasuries breathed. But across the Channel, Charles VII was rebuilding something far stronger than armies. He was rebuilding France itself. Under his command, the French crown organized a standing army, trained and paid regularly, no longer dependent on feudal levies. Artillery and new tactics began to define the field. The English garrisons, isolated and poorly supplied, found themselves facing an enemy that had learned from its long years of defeat. By 1449, the truce unraveled. French forces advanced into Normandy with methodical precision, town by town, fortress by fortress. The map that had once glowed red with English banners began to fade. Rouen, the proud Norman capital and symbol of English authority, surrendered after a brief siege. The fall of the city sent shockwaves through both realms. For the French, it was redemption. For the English, humiliation. In London, Suffolk's enemies seized their moment. They accused him of incompetence, of corruption, even of secret collusion with the French. Parliament erupted with fury. The Commons demanded his removal. The Lords whispered of his downfall. The Queen pleaded for mercy, but public hatred had grown too deep. In 1450, Suffolk was banished from England. He left the court quietly, escorted to the coast under royal protection. Chroniclers record that as his ship sailed from Dover, crowds on the shore jeered and threw stones, cursing his name. To them, his departure symbolized not justice achieved, but a kingdom collapsing under its own shame. Days later, the ship carrying him was intercepted by a band of English sailors loyal to no master but their own anger. They seized the Duke, held a mock trial at sea, and executed him. His body was cast upon the shore near Dover, a silent offering to the fury of a nation. The man who had once ruled the king's confidence now drifted like wreckage on the tide. The news of his death spread like fire. In Westminster, the courtiers spoke in whispers. In the streets, the people shouted in triumph. But beneath the noise, there was unease. Suffolk's fall had not saved England. It had only exposed how broken the kingdom had become. Across the Channel, events moved with relentless speed. After Rouen came Caen, then Cherbourg, and finally all of Normandy. Within months, England's greatest continental possession was gone. The soldiers who survived limped home to a land that could no longer feed or employ them. Many turned to robbery or revolt, wandering veterans who had once been the pride of Agincourt, now reduced to beggars of the crown. Charles VII, emboldened by victory, pressed further south. In 1451, Bordeaux and the rich province of Gascony fell after generations of English rule. The ancient alliance between England and the wine merchants of the region, a bond older than the 100 Years' War itself, was broken. The empire that Henry V had forged with sword and flame was reduced to a single outpost, Calais. At home, rebellion followed defeat. In Kent, Jack Cade led thousands of angry men to march on London, demanding justice for the people and punishment for the traitors who had lost France. For weeks, the capital trembled as mobs filled its streets, crying out the names of Suffolk and Somerset. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, its message could not be silenced. England no longer trusted its rulers. Through it all, Henry VI remained passive, bewildered, prayerful, and fragile. He spoke of forgiveness even as his kingdom fractured. He believed that peace was still possible, that God would restore harmony if only men would cease their anger. But the time for prayer had passed. The nobility no longer looked to him for guidance. The people no longer looked to him for hope. The queen did her best to fill the void. Margaret of Anjou rode through the country with confidence, speaking at councils, demanding loyalty, defending the crown with all the fierceness her husband lacked. Yet her foreign birth and sharp mind made her an easy target for resentment. To her enemies, she was not a protector, but a manipulator, a Frenchwoman ruling an English king. Each defeat abroad deepened the fractures at home. The court became a maze of suspicion and blame. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, inherited Suffolk's role as chief minister, but his leadership brought little change. The treasury was empty, the army demoralized, and the crown's prestige diminished. Letters from Normandy described panic. Reports from Gascony spoke of despair. And through it all, Henry VI continued to issue gentle proclamations for peace, as if words alone could mend a world unraveling. By 1453, the last spark of English power in France flickered out at Castillon, where John Talbot, the old hero of the wars, fell in a final futile defense of Gascony. News of his death reached England like the tolling of a bell. For the first time in a century, England's kings no longer ruled any part of France beyond Calais. The empire was gone, and with it, the illusion of destiny that had bound the two nations. At Windsor, they said the king received the news in silence. For days he spoke to no one, withdrawing into prayer. His mind, always fragile, seemed to falter beneath the weight of loss. Ministers came and went. Reports were laid before him, but he gave no answer. He sat with his Bible open before him, his eyes fixed on the words but unseeing. The empire of Henry I had ended not with a roar of battle, but with the whisper of neglect, undone by weak hearts and weary hands. The court that once commanded half of France now commanded nothing but uncertainty, and at its center sat a king who could no longer rule, a man adrift in faith, while the world he inherited slipped quietly into ruin. The kingdom that Henry II had inherited was now little more than a memory of its former greatness, a land haunted by loss abroad and division at home. The France his father had conquered was gone. The wealth that had once flowed through its ports vanished, and the confidence that had carried England across generations was spent. What remained was a realm split in spirit, and at its heart stood two figures, husband and wife, each living in a world the other could not enter. Henry II drifted deeper into the realm of devotion. The more chaotic the world became, the more he sought refuge in prayer. To him, politics was noise, and the affairs of men were distractions from divine truth. He rose before dawn to hear Mass, spent hours in meditation, and spoke of visions of saints and angels. Those around him whispered that he saw heaven more clearly than earth. His piety was sincere, but it came at a cost, Every moment spent in contemplation was a moment lost to governance. He would walk the halls of Windsor, murmuring psalms while petitions and reports piled up on his desk. Ambassadors waited in vain for audiences that never came. His counselors could not rouse him to anger or action. He believed the kingdom's suffering was a trial sent by God, and that patience and faith would bring deliverance. It was a conviction as gentle as it was dangerous. Margaret of Anjou, by contrast, lived entirely in the realm of power. The more her husband withdrew, the more fiercely she took up the burden he laid down. Intelligent, eloquent, and proud, she became the true voice of the court. She met with ministers, negotiated with nobles, and even reviewed military plans. Many admired her energy, others feared it. She was, in every sense, a queen in the age of kings. But in England, ruled by men nostalgic for Henry I's steel, such strength in a woman provoked suspicion. Her closest ally was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a polished nobleman and soldier whose loyalty to the crown was matched only by his loyalty to her. Somerset had inherited Suffolk's place as chief advisor and quickly became the Queen's most trusted confidant. He was handsome, ambitious, and deeply conscious of his status as a Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, and thus kin to the royal line. But that bloodline also made him a rival to another powerful claimant, Richard, Duke of York. York had long been excluded from influence despite his lineage and military experience. He had served as regent in France with distinction, only to see his achievements undone by Somerset's failures. The enmity between them grew from grievance into open hostility. To York and his followers, Somerset represented everything that had gone wrong: favoritism, weakness, and the dominance of foreign influence through the Queen. To Margaret, York was a threat. A man too proud, too close to the throne, and too dangerous to be trusted. Between these two poles, the Queen and York, England began to tear itself apart. The nobility divided into camps, each swearing loyalty not to the crown, but to a cause. In council chambers and at great halls across the shires, alliances were whispered, marriages arranged, and grudges sharpened into prophecy. The country was restless. The memory of war still lingered in the minds of men. The peace Henry had prayed for was giving birth to a different kind of conflict, one that would not be fought on foreign soil, but within England's own heart. Somerset's leadership only deepened the fractures. His tenure was marked by indecision abroad and arrogance at home. Reports from Calais told of mismanagement. Letters from the north spoke of rising unrest. Parliament demanded his removal, accusing him of corruption and incompetence. Margaret defended him fiercely, turning every accusation into a defense of royal authority. To attack Somerset, she told her allies, is to attack the king himself. But few saw the king anymore. Henry's presence had become a formality, a signature on documents, a name invoked in speeches. At court, his silence grew heavier than any decree. He appeared at ceremonies pale and distracted, offering benedictions to crowds that looked past him toward the Queen. Those who met his gaze said it was kind, but distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of Westminster. England itself seemed to mirror the divide within its rulers. In the monasteries, priests prayed for the king's health and for the peace he so desired. In the marketplaces, men muttered that God had abandoned them. The nobility armed their retainers, fortifying estates that had once stood open in confidence. Rival badges, the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster, began to appear in whispers first, then on banners. The seeds of the Wars of the Roses had been sown, quietly but inexorably. In private, Margaret's determination hardened into isolation. She trusted few beyond Somerset and her closest household. Each setback in France, each riot in London seemed to drive her deeper into resolve. She believed that only strength, not compromise, could save the crown. Her opponents, however, saw in her ambition the spark of tyranny. Pamphlets and rumors painted her as a second Jezebel, a queen who ruled through deceit and foreign cunning. Henry, meanwhile, sank further into the stillness of faith. His mind, always delicate, began to waver under the weight of failure and expectation. Some nights, courtiers found him kneeling alone in the chapel, unmoving for hours, whispering prayers no one could hear. At times, he spoke of visions, of saints warning him to abandon worldly strife, of angels calling him to humility. Ministers tried to reach him with matters of state, but his answers were cryptic, dreamlike. "All shall be well," he would say softly, "for it is in God's hands." As months turned to years, the court became a place of two kingdoms, one of spirit, one of power. In one, Henry reigned as a pilgrim king, devoted to the unseen. In the other, Margaret ruled as a sovereign of necessity, fighting not only for her husband's crown, but for her own survival. Between them lay a silence that neither prayer nor politics could bridge. By 1453, the strain reached its breaking point. The loss of France, the failures of Somerset, and the rising influence of York converged into crisis. That summer, as messages of defeat arrived from Gascony, something within Henry seemed to give way. He withdrew into himself entirely, motionless, unresponsive, as if trapped between waking and vision. The courtiers spoke in hushed tones. The king had fallen into a divine trance, or perhaps into madness. In the royal chambers, candles flickered against the stone walls. Margaret sat beside him, watching his still figure, her face half in shadow. Outside, in the distance, the faint sound of drums carried on the wind. A mustering of soldiers in the north, the first echo of civil war. The realm waited, breath held between two worlds, one ruled by a queen who refused to yield, the other by a king lost to heaven. And as the light trembled on the edges of the chamber, the age of Henry VI, fragile, holy, and doomed, slipped into the dawn of a darker storm. By the late 1440s, the illusion of English mastery in France had already begun to fade, but it was in Normandy and Gascony that the dream finally died. What Henry V had conquered with discipline and devotion, his son was now losing to a new kind of war, one that no longer belonged to knights and banners, but to gunpowder and strategy. Charles VII, once mocked as the King of Bourges, had transformed France from a divided realm into a modern kingdom. His court at Bourges had been poor and exiled. His crown once depended on faith more than force. But years of survival had changed him. Now he ruled not with desperation, but with design. Around him gathered a new generation of commanders, men not of noble blood, but of talent. Among them, Jean Barrot stood out, a quiet, calculating master of artillery who understood that the future of warfare would be written not in charges of cavalry, but in the thunder of cannon. Under Charles and Barrot, the French army became something England had never imagined it could face. Gone were the disorganized feudal levies and mercenaries that had once stumbled against the longbow. In their place came a disciplined force, paid, drilled, and supplied. Artillery units moved with precision, and siege warfare turned into a science. The castles that had guarded Normandy for generations were no longer fortresses, but targets. When war returned in 1449, it came not as a wave of vengeance, but as a tide of inevitability. The French offensive began methodically, sweeping across Normandy with the quiet confidence of a kingdom that finally knew its strength. Town after town opened its gates. The English, cut off from supplies and leadership, fought bravely, but without hope. At Rouen, the proud capital of English Normandy, the end came swiftly. The city that had once seen the trial of Jeanne d'Arc now watched the retreat of her conquerors. The Duke of Somerset, charged with defending the province, hesitated between negotiation and resistance, and lost both. The French artillery pounded the walls, the population rose in revolt, and within days the gates were opened. The fleur-de-lis replaced the Red Cross of St. George, and the bells of Rouen rang not for victory, but for deliverance. For the English soldiers who escaped, the road south was one of despair. Caen, the great stronghold by the sea, became the next to fall. Its garrison fought with the courage of habit rather than conviction, surrounded by enemies who no longer feared them. Jean Barrot's cannons shattered the defenses with precision. The old rhythms of medieval warfare, the charge, the duel, the gallant stand, meant nothing now. The future had arrived, and it spoke with the voice of fire. The final blow came at Formigny in April 1450. The English army under Sir Thomas Carriel was marching to relieve Caen. They were veterans, proud survivors of a century of victories. Their banners bore faded emblems of Agincourt and Crécy, relics of another age. Facing them was the French force led by the Bureau brothers, commanded by the Count of Clermont. The battlefield was open countryside, rolling fields, hedgerows, and mist. At first, the English longbowmen held their ground as they always had. Arrows flew in dark clouds, striking with deadly rhythm. For a brief moment, it seemed that the ghost of Henry I still watched over them. But then, from behind a line of trees, the French artillery began its work. The sound rolled across the fields like a storm breaking the horizon. The longbow, weapon of English legend, met its silence in the roar of cannon. One by one, the formations buckled, the ground trembled, the air filled with smoke and cries. When French cavalry struck the flanks, the line collapsed. The English fought stubbornly, but the old miracle, that thin line of archers against the world, no longer worked. Warfare itself had changed, and they had not changed with it. By sunset, Formigny was lost. Thousands lay scattered across the fields, their banners trampled into mud. When news reached Caen, the last English commanders understood the truth. Normandy was gone. In the chronicles, the battle is described in sober language, but the memory of it feels cinematic. A vision of a dying world. Smoke drifts over the plain. A broken banner marked with the red cross hangs limply from a shattered lance. A knight kneels beside the fallen standard, his armor streaked with dust, his face turned away. Behind him, the cannons still thunder, indifferent to prayer or pride. Those who returned to England did so in silence. Their ships landed at Portsmouth and Sandwich, carrying not plunder, but stories. Of walls collapsing under fire, of towns welcoming their conquerors, of comrades left behind. For the first time in living memory, England's soldiers came home, not as heroes, but as reminders of defeat. The government in London tried to contain the despair. Proclamations spoke of temporary setbacks, of truces soon to be renewed, but no proclamation could erase the truth. Normandy, the heart of England's continental empire since William the Conqueror, was gone forever. The fields that had once nourished the pride of an island now belonged to France again. In Gascony, the last remnant of English rule tried to stand firm. Bordeaux, loyal for centuries, raised the Red Cross once more. The merchants of the city, bound to England by trade and memory, begged for aid. But no army came. Somerset's forces were exhausted, and the treasury was empty. The French, led again by Charles VII's new commanders, moved south with efficiency and purpose. By 1451, Gascony had fallen too. The English presence in France had been reduced to a single outpost, Calais. What had begun as a holy war for dominion had ended as an echo. A century of ambition dissolved in the mist of defeat. Those who chronicled the time wrote of omens and divine judgment. They said England was being punished for its sins, for pride and neglect. But history, more than punishment, often moves in transformation. France had entered a new age, while England lingered in the old. The cannon had replaced the bow, the professional soldier had replaced the knight, and monarchy itself was learning to rule not by conquest, but by consolidation. Yet for the men who had lived through it, there was no philosophy, only silence. On the fields of Normandy, the air still smelled of smoke. The bones of forgotten archers rested beneath the grass. And in England, beneath the shadow of Westminster, the courtiers still spoke of recovery, of honor, of hope, even as their world, quietly and irreversibly, had changed forever. In that twilight between centuries, the age of English glory in France came to its close. No grand speech marked the end, no final victory. Only the image remains, the smoke hanging low over a battlefield, the banner of St. George fallen in the mud, and a weary English captain standing amid the haze, whispering a prayer that no longer had an empire to protect. By the summer of 1453, the long shadow of the 100 Years' War was drawing to its end. Only Gascony remained, a last flickering remnant of England's empire in France. The fields around Bordeaux still bore the red cross of St. George, and the merchants still spoke of loyalty to the English crown. For a century, the wine trade and shared prosperity had bound the region to the island across the sea. But history was moving, and Gascony's time under English rule was running out. King Charles VII had resolved to finish what his ancestors began. His commanders, veterans of Normandy's reconquest, now turned their gaze southward. Among them were Jean Bureau and his brother Gaspar, the same masters of artillery who had broken the English line at Formigny. They came not with chivalric banners or grand declarations, but with order, organization, and the thunder of guns that define the new age. Across the Channel, England was exhausted, financially drained, politically divided, and spiritually spent. Henry VI, withdrawn into silence and prayer, was no longer a presence in governance. The Duke of Somerset's efforts to defend France were collapsing, and the nobles at home were too busy quarreling over influence to think of Gascony. Yet even in decline, one name still carried the echo of the old glory: John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. He was called the last English knight, a man out of time, forged in the spirit of an age that was dying before his eyes. Talbot had fought in France for decades, his courage and discipline legendary even among his enemies. He embodied the martial code of Henry IV's generation: duty, loyalty, and an unyielding belief in the justice of his king's cause. To the French, he was both feared and respected. To the English, he was a living reminder of what they once had been. When Bordeaux appealed for help, it was Talbot who answered. He was nearly 70 years old, his hair white, his body worn, but his resolve untouched. He landed in Gascony in the spring of 1453, greeted by cheering crowds who still believed the Lion of England would roar once more. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old spirit had returned. The banners of St. George fluttered above the walls, the drums beat, and the wine merchant spoke again of our good English friends. But the world Talbot knew no longer existed. The French army that approached was not the scattered host he had faced in his youth. It was modern, relentless, and armed with artillery that could turn castles to dust. Jean Bureau's guns moved with mechanical precision, and his troops, disciplined veterans of Normandy, marched behind them like the tide. In July, the French laid siege to the town of Castillon-sur-Dordogne. Talbot, commanding a smaller force, believed the French had retreated and led his men forward to strike. It was the old instinct of a knight: courage before calculation, valor before caution. What awaited him, however, was not an open field, but a carefully fortified camp, ringed with cannon. The French had prepared for this very moment. As Talbot's men advanced, the air trembled with the first roar of artillery. The echo rolled across the valley, shaking the ground beneath the English horses. Smoke blossomed like storm clouds. For the first time, the proud longbowmen of England, heirs to Crécy and Agincourt, found themselves powerless against the new weapon of war. The sound of bowstrings was drowned by the relentless thunder of cannon fire. Talbot rode among his men, shouting encouragement, his voice steady amid the chaos. His presence alone seemed to hold the line together, a solitary figure of steel and faith. His son, Lord Lisle, fought beside him, refusing to abandon his father's side. The two generations stood together, the past and the future of England's chivalry, facing a world that no longer had a place for either. As the French tightened their fire, the English formation faltered. The valley filled with smoke so dense that men could scarcely see one another. A cannonball struck near Talbot's horse, throwing him to the ground. The soldiers tried to rally around him, but the line was collapsing. When the French cavalry charged from the flanks, the last English resistance crumbled. By the day's end, Castillon was silent, except for the crackle of smoke and the ringing of spent metal. The banner of St. George, torn and dust-covered, lay among the trampled earth. John Talbot, the old lion, had fallen, not in defeat of spirit, but in the passing of an era. News of his death crossed the Channel slowly, carried by ships that brought back the last remnants of England's army. When it reached London, the city fell into stunned quiet. Chroniclers wrote of the loss with reverence, not only for the man, but for the age he represented. With Talbot, one wrote, fell the sword of England's valor, and the flame of her conquest went out. Bordeaux surrendered soon after. The people, once loyal to England, opened their gates to Charles VII. The fleur-de-lis was raised over the city walls, gleaming in the summer light. It was the end of 300 years of English presence in the southwest of France. From the days of Eleanor of Aquitaine to the last breath of Talbot's army, only Calais remained in English hands, a narrow bridgehead on foreign soil, a monument to what had been. The rest was gone. Gascony, Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, all reclaimed by a France reborn under Charles VII. In the chronicles, the fall of Bordeaux is written as the closing of a chapter, but in truth, It was the closing of a destiny. The dream that had begun with William the Conqueror and reached its height under Henry V ended in the dust of Castillon. The empire of English kings, born in conquest, had vanished not in betrayal or treachery, but in the natural turning of history's tide. On the fields of Gascony, the evening wind moved through the empty tents, carrying with it the faint scent of powder and the distant sound of church bells. The cannons stood still, their work complete, and beneath the fading light, a tattered English banner clung to a broken lance, its red cross dim against the smoke-stained sky, the last symbol of a vanished empire. That night, France slept in peace for the first time in 100 years. And across the sea, in a quiet chapel at Windsor, a king knelt before the altar praying for a realm he could no longer hold, whispering the name of a knight whose courage had outlived an age. The news from Castillon reached England like a slow-moving storm. It crossed the sea not with trumpets or cries, but in silence, a silence heavier than words. Couriers brought the message first to Westminster. Gascony had fallen, Bordeaux had surrendered, and John Talbot, the last great English knight, was dead. The empire Henry V had carved with courage and prayer was gone. When the tidings reached Henry VI, he did not rage, nor weep, nor call his council. Those around him said that he merely stared ahead, his lips moving without sound, as though he were speaking to a voice no one else could hear. Then he fell still. For days he neither ate nor spoke. His attendants believed him struck by illness. Physicians whispered of fever, of fatigue, of melancholy. But it was not the body that had failed him. It was the mind, overwhelmed by the weight of loss, crushed by the breaking of a dream he had inherited but never understood. The king's silence deepened into something unearthly. He could sit for hours, motionless, eyes unfocused, hands resting lightly on the arm of his chair. When servants came to dress him, he did not move. When bishops prayed beside him, he did not blink. He breathed, he lived, but his spirit seemed to have gone elsewhere, into a realm only he could see. Chroniclers would later call it a holy trance. Others, more fearful, would call it madness. Whatever its name, it marked the moment when the crown of England lost its voice. The court around him dissolved into confusion. Messages from Gascony piled up unread. Petitioners waited in vain for royal judgment. Margaret of Anjou, heavily pregnant at the time, became both guardian and regent, forced to govern a realm whose king could no longer speak. She was barely 23, but her face aged in months what others might in years. In October 1453, she gave birth to a son, Edward, Prince of Wales. It should have been a moment of joy, a sign that the dynasty had survived. Bells rang across London, church choirs sang hymns of thanksgiving. The people prayed that a new generation might restore what had been lost. But in Windsor, the king lay still, unaware. When Margaret brought the infant to him, placing the tiny boy in his arms, Henry did not stir. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. For a moment, the chamber was silent except for the sound of the baby's soft cry. Margaret, exhausted yet resolute, whispered the child's name, hoping it might rouse some flicker of recognition. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling. "Your son, my lord, your heir." But Henry's hand did not tighten, his lips did not move. He remained frozen in that eerie calm, a man alive, yet unreachable. To those who witnessed it, the scene became legend, the image of England itself. A mother holding life in her arms beside a father lost in spiritual darkness. Faith and blood, prayer and inheritance, side by side, unable to touch. Outside the royal chambers, the realm began to unravel. Nobles murmured that the king's illness was a curse. Others claimed it was punishment for his sins or for England's pride. The council split between those who supported Queen Margaret and those who sought new leadership under Richard, Duke of York. The political storm that would one day become the Wars of the Roses had begun to gather its first clouds. Margaret fought to preserve dignity amid despair. She prayed beside her husband daily, kneeling before the same altar, her crown set aside. She begged God to restore his mind, to return his spirit, so that their child might know a father and their people might know a king. Each day she rose, dry-eyed and determined, to govern in his name. Yet the courtiers whispered behind her back. Some admired her strength, others feared her ambition. They said the queen ruled too fiercely, that she trusted only herself. In truth, she had no choice. She ruled because there was no one else left to rule. Henry's condition did not improve. Months passed, then a year. He heard but did not respond. He looked but did not see. His once gentle speech, his habit of blessing others with soft words of comfort, had vanished. He no longer recognized his counsel, his wife, or even the child who would bear his name. His mind seemed trapped between heaven and earth, suspended in prayer that never ended. Chroniclers of the time wrote of eerie serenity within the royal chambers. Candles burned low through the night. The queen's ladies moved in silence. Physicians came and went, murmuring Latin incantations and leaving with eyes downcast. Outside, London carried on. Merchants shouted in the markets, bells rang for mass. But within the palace walls, time itself felt still. For Margaret, the dual weight of motherhood and monarchy pressed down like stone. She had gained a son but lost a husband, inherited a crown but lost a kingdom. Her nights were spent between the cradle and the bedside, one symbolizing life, the other a shadow of death. In her prayers, she begged not for victory or vengeance, but for a miracle, that her husband might wake, might speak, might look at his child and remember who he was. But the miracle never came. The loss of France had not only stripped England of land, it had stripped it of purpose. For generations, the dream of empire had united the nobles, inspired poets, and given the crown its glory. Now, without that dream, the nation turned inward. The treasury was empty, the people disillusioned, and faith in the monarchy crumbled. The silence of the king became the silence of England itself. Parliament debated who should govern. York's allies argued that divine providence had chosen a new protector, while the queen's supporters clung fiercely to her authority. The line between loyalty and rebellion grew thin. Rumors spread that the prince was not the king's child, a whisper born of envy and fear, but one that would haunt the court for years to come. And through it all, Henry remained still, an unmoving figure in a world unraveling. Some said he smiled faintly at times, as if seeing visions no one else could perceive. Perhaps in his mind the battles had never been lost. Perhaps he still walked with his saints among the chapels of Windsor, untroubled by war or politics. But to the realm outside, his stillness was not peace. It was abandonment. One winter night, as snow fell outside the castle, Margaret sat alone beside him. The fire burned low. The candlelight flickered across the floor. The child slept in another chamber, and only the queen remained, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on her husband's vacant gaze. "My lord," she whispered, "they say England has lost her soul, but I will not let them take yours." Her voice trembled, but her resolve did not. Beyond the walls, the realm she fought to protect was sliding toward chaos. Yet in that room, in that silence, something sacred endured. Henry did not answer. He would not for many months more. But as the candle flame wavered and the wind pressed against the windows, it seemed that all of England, its grief, its faith, its fading hope, rested within that quiet chamber. The king's stillness had become a mirror of the nation's soul, weary, wounded, and waiting for dawn. In the wake of France's collapse, the silence that hung over England began to crack, not with the voice of kings, but with the cry of the people. The losses abroad had drained the treasury and broken the nation's pride. Merchants spoke of empty harbors, farmers cursed the weather and the taxes that bled them dry, and veterans, men who had once marched under Henry VI, wandered the roads with no pay and no purpose. The dream of empire was gone, but its cost remained, and when the crown could no longer bear that burden, it fell upon the common people. By the spring of 1450, Kent, a county that had long felt the weight of royal neglect, became the spark. The ports along the Channel were restless, their ships idle, their workers hungry. News of Normandy's fall and Suffolk's death had spread like wildfire. The people whispered that England was being sold piece by piece, not to the French, but to traders within. In the taverns, ballads mocked the nobles. On the walls of London, graffiti began to appear in bold, angry strokes. Down with the traitors of France. The name that rose from this anger was Jack Cade. No one knew him well. Some said he was a soldier who had fought in France, others that he was merely a tradesman driven to rebellion. But to the people, he became something greater, a voice that spoke what they dared not say. He called himself John Mortimer, claiming distant kinship with the powerful Duke of York, a name that lent him both legitimacy and mystery. What he lacked in lineage, he made up for in conviction. Cade's message was simple and incendiary. He denounced the corruption of the royal council, the tyranny of taxes, and the betrayal of those who had lost France through greed and incompetence. The poor starve while the mighty feast, he declared, and England bleeds for their deceit. His words spread across the countryside like a sermon. Farmers, craftsmen, discharged soldiers all began to gather beneath his banner. By early June, a mass of men from Kent and the surrounding shires marched toward London. They called themselves the true Commons of England, not rebels but reformers, fighting not against the king but against those who had misled him. It was a subtle distinction, yet a powerful one, a sign that the people still loved the crown, even as they despised those who wore it. When Cade's army reached Blackheath just outside the city, it was tens of thousands strong. The royal forces, hastily assembled, hesitated. Many soldiers sympathized with the cause. The government, paralyzed by indecision, sent envoys to parley. Cade received them with the formality of a nobleman, presenting a petition rather than a threat. It listed demands: fair justice, lower taxes, punishment for corrupt officials, and the removal of evil counselors who had betrayed England's trust. The petition, written in careful, almost legal language, carried the weight of truth. Even among the nobility, few could deny its justice. But behind the words burned the fire of desperation. When no answer came, Cade and his followers moved forward. On a warm day in early July, they entered London. Not as invaders, but as victors of conscience. The city received them with uneasy applause. Citizens lined the streets, some cheering, others afraid. Cade rode through Southwark on horseback, dressed in armor, his face calm but resolute. To his followers he seemed a man chosen by Providence. To his enemies, a sign that England itself was coming undone. Inside the city, order teetered on the edge. Cade's men sought out officials accused of corruption, seized documents, and proclaimed new decrees. They hung banners calling for reform and for the punishment of traitors. Yet as night fell, discipline began to wane. The mob that had marched for justice now found itself surrounded by temptation, wine, silver, vengeance. London's narrow streets echoed with shouts and confusion. Still, for a brief moment, it seemed that something extraordinary had happened. That common men had seized the pulse of a kingdom. Cade himself tried to hold control, declaring that no man should harm another without cause, that we fight for law, not for plunder. But the cause was already slipping from his hands. The government, humiliated, responded with swiftness. Royal troops regrouped under loyal commanders and advanced on the city. Promises of pardon were issued to those who would lay down arms. Many did. The rest, weary and disorganized, began to retreat toward Kent. Cade refused to surrender. He believed, perhaps to the end, that justice was still on his side. As his followers dispersed, the rebellion faded as suddenly as it had begun. Cade himself fled into the countryside, pursued by royal soldiers. Within weeks he was captured and killed. His body, displayed at London Bridge, was meant as a warning. But the warning fell upon deaf hearts. For though the rebellion had ended, its echo remained. The words scrawled upon the walls, "Down with the traitors of France," lingered like a curse. They spoke not only of war and loss, but of a nation betrayed by its own weakness. Cade had not overthrown a government. He had revealed one already crumbling. And so England in 1450 stood at a precipice. The peasants returned to their fields, the merchants to their stalls, the nobles to their quarrels. The city cleaned its streets, the council resumed its rituals, and the crown pretended that order had been restored. But beneath the surface, the same anger burned. The sense that something sacred had been broken, that the bond between ruler and ruled had thinned to a thread. Jack Cade was gone, but his shadow stretched far beyond Kent. In his rebellion, England had glimpsed its own reflection, not the glory of Agincourt, but the exhaustion of a people forgotten by those who ruled them. The uprising had been crushed, yet its spirit would live on. whispering in the hearts of those who would one day draw sword against one another under the banners of red and white. For the voice that rose from Kent was not merely rebellion, it was prophecy, a warning that the storm to come would not rise from France, but from within England itself. When the fires of rebellion in Kent faded into ashes, England found itself leaderless in spirit and trembling in doubt. The people had cried out for justice, and though Jack Cade's revolt had been crushed, the echoes of his anger still hung in the air. The streets of London were swept clean, but the kingdom's wounds were not. The question whispered through every hall and marketplace was the same. If the king could not rule, who would? Into that silence rode Richard, Duke of York. He returned from Ireland in the autumn of 1450, a tall, grave man with the bearing of command and the calm of conviction. His armor was polished but unadorned. His banners carried not the arrogance of rebellion, but the dignity of lineage. To many, his arrival felt like the return of something long forgotten, a figure of strength and principle in an age of weakness and compromise. York had watched from afar as England lost her empire and her faith. He had been sent to Ireland years before, both as governor and exile, removed from politics by those who feared his influence. But news of Normandy's fall, Suffolk's disgrace, and Cade's rebellion had reached him even across the sea. He saw in it not merely chaos, but opportunity, a divine summons to restore the kingdom that others had let decay. He came back, as he declared, not to challenge the crown, but to save it from those who abuse it. His enemies called him ambitious. His followers called him righteous. He called himself loyal, and in that word, loyalty, began the perilous illusion that would soon divide England in two. At first, his return was met with caution. Queen Margaret viewed him with suspicion, the Duke of Somerset, her trusted ally, with open hostility. Somerset had inherited Suffolk's power and, with it, the resentment of every man who had lost something in France. To York, he was the embodiment of all England's failures, corrupt, inept, and shielded by royal favor. York's strategy was not a sword, but a sermon. He rode through the shires, speaking to lords and gentry of reform, of restoring law, of purging the court of evil counselors. His words struck deep. The nobles, weary of Margaret's foreign influence and Somerset's arrogance, began to look to York as the only man who could rescue England from its drift toward ruin. In London, rumors spread faster than decrees. The Duke of York, people whispered, is the true heir of Plantagenet blood. It was not only flattery, it was truth. York's lineage stretched back to Lionel of Antwerp, second son of Edward III, giving him a stronger hereditary claim to the throne than Henry himself, who descended from a younger line. At first, such talk was quiet, spoken only behind closed doors. But in a realm where the king was silent and the queen was foreign, the idea of a new ruler, one of English birth and English heart, began to sound less like treason and more like hope. Henry VI, meanwhile, had emerged slowly from his long trance. The miracle Margaret had prayed for seemed, at last, to have come. He could speak again, though softly, walk again, though with hesitation. His memory returned in fragments, as though the mind that had been lost to heaven had only half returned to earth. But the king who opened his eyes in 1454 was not the man England remembered. He smiled with gentleness, but no authority. He listened, but did not decide. He thanked those around him for their service, yet shrank from their quarrels. To some, his holiness was touching, a king too saintly for politics, too pure for power. To others, it was terrifying. The realm did not need a monk. It needed a monarch. York recognized this weakness instantly. To him, Henry's frailty was both tragedy and proof, a sign that God had chosen another to guide England through its darkness. Publicly, he professed obedience. Privately, he gathered strength. Parliament convened at Westminster, and York demanded that Somerset be held accountable for the loss of Normandy and the ruin of our honor. The charges, though not proven, struck like lightning through the court. Margaret defended Somerset fiercely. She called York a schemer, a man using patriotism as a mask for ambition. He would save the kingdom, she said bitterly, but only by claiming it. Her words carried through the palace, and from that moment the lines between queen and duke were drawn. Outside the court, the people began to choose sides. In London's taverns, men toasted York's name. In the churches, priests prayed for the king's recovery while whispering that perhaps York was England's true protector. Even among the nobles, loyalties split. The great houses of Neville and Percy eyed one another across the north, their ancient feud reigniting under the tension of a divided nation. The queen, seeing danger in every shadow, tried to tighten her circle. She surrounded herself with loyalists, Somerset, Beaufort, and a few clerics who assured her that divine law was on her side. But outside those chambers, her influence waned. The common people no longer saw her as the mother of England's future, but as the guardian of its decline. In 1454, as Parliament met amid rising tension, Henry's condition worsened again. He fell back into a state of passivity, unresponsive and withdrawn. The throne, in all but name, was vacant. With the approval of the council, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector of the realm. For the first time, he held in his hands the power he had long sought, not as usurper, but as savior. He reformed the courts, reduced corruption, restored local order. The people rejoiced. The nobles breathed easier. For a fleeting year, it seemed as though England might yet find its balance. But power, once granted, rarely returns quietly. When Henry recovered again in early 1455, the fragile peace shattered. Somerset was restored, and York was dismissed. The reforms he had begun were undone, the offices he had filled replaced by those loyal to the Queen. It was as if his year of rule had been erased, except that the people remembered. They had seen, if only briefly, a kingdom that functioned, a government that listened. York retired from court outwardly calm, but inside the fire burned brighter than ever. He had tasted authority and seen how easily it could save the realm, if only he held it permanently. And so, while Henry prayed and Margaret plotted, Richard of York waited. He did not need to raise his voice. The nation was already speaking for him. Every merchant cheated by tax, every veteran forgotten by the crown, every noble alienated by Somerset's arrogance. All were turning, slowly but inexorably, toward the man who promised to restore what England had lost. The rebellion of the Commons had failed, but now another kind of rebellion, colder, more deliberate, born not from hunger but from ambition, was taking shape. The age of petitions was ending. The age of banners was about to begin. The year 1455 dawned with an uneasy quiet, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the breath before a storm. England, weary of rebellion and failure, seemed to hold its breath. Yet beneath the stillness, loyalties were shifting like sand beneath the tide. The court was divided, the nobles restless, and the name of York, once spoken as a promise, was now whispered as a threat. The old order was dying, and something darker was taking its place. In London, the court of Henry VI had turned into a theater of factions. On one side stood Queen Margaret and her circle, proud, unyielding, determined to preserve the power of the Lancastrian line. On the other stood Richard of York and his growing alliance of reformers and noble families, convinced that only by purging the court of corruption could England be saved. It was not yet war, but it was no longer peace. Margaret was no longer merely the consort of a fragile king. She had become the guardian of a dynasty, a mother who saw in her young son Edward the last hope of the Lancasters. Her instincts were sharpened by fear that York's influence might one day sweep the crown from her child's head. "He says he serves the throne," she told her council, "but I see the hunger in his eyes." To her, York was not a reformer, but a rival in disguise. York in turn saw himself as the savior of a nation betrayed by its own rulers. He did not yet dream of a crown, or at least would not admit it. What he desired, or claimed to desire, was a kingdom governed by law, not by favoritism. Yet the more the queen resisted him, the more others began to see in him what he himself began to believe. A man born not only to lead, but perhaps to rule. The realm began to polarize. Great houses, once bound by loyalty to the same monarch, now chose colors as if for battle. The red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York. Two emblems, simple and innocent in design, but soon to become symbols of division that would stain the century. Across the shires, banners were quietly sown, oaths quietly taken. The Nevilles, powerful allies of York, prepared their men. The Percys, loyal to Lancaster, did the same. In castles and taverns alike, men debated which rose they would wear if the day came. The sound of sharpening blades began to replace that of church bells. Henry VI, trapped between two tides, prayed for unity. He sought reconciliation, called for councils, urged forgiveness, but every meeting only deepened the divide. He spoke of divine mercy, they spoke of earthly justice. His pleas for peace echoed through halls already hollow with mistrust. The council chambers grew colder. Somerset, restored to power, began to act with open arrogance. He ignored York's reforms, replaced loyal men with his own, and whispered into the Queen's ear that only firmness, even force, could contain York's ambition. Margaret listened. By the spring of 1455, letters were being sent under seal, summoning troops for the king's protection. Both sides claimed the same cause. York gathered his forces in the north. Margaret and Somerset called their loyalists to the south. No one yet dared to call it war, but the word hung unspoken in the air. The people watched in dread. To them, it was no longer about policies or court intrigue. It was about names, Lancaster and York, and which one God would favor. Some still prayed for the king to rise above the quarrel, but others had already lost faith in his frail will. In May, the court planned to meet at the town of St. Albans. The intent outwardly was peace, a final council to resolve the tension between York and Somerset. Yet those who rode there knew otherwise. Behind polite words lay hidden armor. Every man who arrived did so with a sword at his side. The morning of May 22nd, 1455, was bright but cold. The fields outside St. Albans shimmered with dew. The air was sharp with the scent of spring. Within the town, shutters were closed. Prayers whispered. The two hosts approached. Not vast armies, but enough to decide the fate of a kingdom. York's banners fluttered in the wind. The white rose, clean and proud. Across the field, the red of Lancaster stood defiant. Between them lay the town's narrow streets, silent but tense, like a heartbeat before the first strike. The chroniclers would later write that it was the Queen's will that led to battle, others that it was York's. In truth, it was neither. The storm had been gathering for years, born of failure, pride, and fear, and now, under the pale light of morning, it could no longer be contained. At first, the two sides exchanged messages. York demanded the arrest of Somerset. The royal camp refused. He insisted he fought for the king's honor. They accused him of rebellion. Words turned to threats, threats to orders. Then, at last, the silence broke. The clash began, not with a roar, but with the faint metallic whisper of steel meeting steel, the sound of a kingdom breaking its own peace. The streets of St. Albans filled with confusion, shouts, and the ringing of arms. The white and red roses, once symbols of beauty, now marked the beginning of a wound that would scar England for generations. As the sun sank low over the town, its light fell upon smoke rising between the houses, and upon the figure of a king once again caught between worlds. His body in England, his mind far away. By nightfall, the field belonged to York. Somerset was slain, and Henry, wounded and dazed, was found beneath a banner torn by wind. But victory brought no triumph, only the certainty that the old peace had ended forever. That night, as the moon rose over the quiet fields of St. Albans, England stood at the edge of a new age. The wind whispered through broken standards, carrying with it the echo of iron and the promise of years of sorrow. The Wars of the Roses had begun, not with a declaration, but with a single sound. The cold, haunting music of swords meeting under the moonlight. In the quiet that followed decades of turmoil, the figure of Henry VI remained, not as a warrior or conqueror, but as a shadow of what kingship could be when virtue and power fell out of harmony. History, ever merciless to the gentle, recorded him not in triumphs, but in silences. The silences of council chambers he could not command, of battlefields he never saw, of prayers that rose unanswered from a throne trembling beneath his hands. He was, as chroniclers would later write, a good man in an evil age, a king who sought holiness rather than dominion, peace rather than victory. Yet his goodness, sincere, luminous, and unyielding, proved a fragile shield against the storm that was England in the 15th century. Henry was born into glory. The infant who once held two crowns of England and France seemed destined to unite them under the will of God. But Providence had other designs. Where his father had been a lion of battle, He was a lamb of faith. He built not fortresses but chapels, waged not war but conscience. The world that awaited him, however, was forged in iron and ambition, a world that did not forgive the meek. And yet, even amid failure, he left a legacy untouched by ruin. It was not carved in stone walls or written in decrees, but in the quiet endurance of learning and spirit. In 1440, Henry founded Eton College, envisioning a place where young minds would be nurtured not for conquest, but for wisdom. A year later, he established King's College, Cambridge, dedicated to faith, study, and service, institutions that would outlast the battles and betrayals that consumed his reign. Centuries later, when the din of the Wars of the Roses had faded to parchment and echo, those schools remained, living testaments to a king whose defeat in politics became his triumph in purpose. Where swords had failed, words would endure. To some, Henry was a fool, too mild to rule, too pious to command. To others, he was a martyr of his own age, a man who tried to bring heaven into a world that preferred earth. He saw kingship not as dominion, but as stewardship, his crown not as a weapon, but as a cross to bear. And in that gentle delusion lay both his nobility and his undoing. He belonged to an age that had no place for him. The chronicles of England moved on, past the fall of France, past the blood of St. Albans, to the long, brutal rhythm of civil war. But the loss of France in 1453 marked more than a military disaster. It was the breaking of a dream, the end of a century in which England had imagined itself a continental power, the equal of kingdoms older and richer than its own. When the fleur-de-lis banner fell from Rouen and Bordeaux, it was not merely land that was lost, but belief. For generations, English kings had ruled with a divine certainty. That victory proved legitimacy, and conquest was the proof of God's favor. Henry's reign shattered that illusion. His defeats stripped the monarchy not just of its empire, but of its sanctity. The king, once anointed by heaven, was now judged by earthly results, and found wanting. The loss of France had a second, deeper consequence. It turned England's gaze inward. With no enemy abroad to unite it, the kingdom turned upon itself. What had begun as whispers of faction became the roar of feud. Lancaster against York, cousin against cousin, each claiming the right to rule a land that had forgotten how to be ruled. From the broken fields of Normandy to the blood-stained streets of St. Albans, the line was unbroken, a single tragic thread connecting the fall of one empire to the tearing apart of another. In the poetic vision of later centuries, it was said that when the last English banner fell in Gascony, its shadow stretched across the Channel, darkening England itself. The fleur-de-lis sank into the soil of France, and in its place, two roses bloomed, one red, one white, watered not by victory, but by pride. Henry lived long enough to see his kingdom fracture, to hear his name invoked by both sides as justification for war. His mind, fragile as it was, could not contain the chaos he had birthed. Yet in his final years, wandering between imprisonment and prayer, he seemed untouched by hatred. His faith, unbroken by all that had collapsed around him, became his last refuge. Those who saw him in the Tower of London spoke of his calm, a stillness that was neither despair nor madness, but resignation. He prayed not for his crown, but for England. And so, when history rendered its verdict, it was not cruel. It did not call him tyrant or villain. It called him ineffective, innocent, and ill-fated. His reign was a wound in time, yet from its pain grew a lesson as enduring as any victory. That virtue without strength is not enough to rule, and strength without virtue is not enough to endure. Centuries would pass before England would see such ruin again. But in every monarch who followed, from the iron hand of Henry VII to the dazzling command of Elizabeth I, there lingered the shadow of Henry VI, a reminder of what happens when goodness sits upon a throne unarmored. In the end, his legacy was not written in crowns or conquests, but in conscience. He left behind schools instead of cities, prayers instead of policies, and a question that every ruler since has faced. Is it better to be feared or to be loved? And what becomes of those who are only loved? As the chronicles close, the final image lingers, not of battlefields or banners, but of the quiet nave of Windsor, Candles flicker in the still air, their light trembling on cold stone. Somewhere, a choir's voice fades into the vaulted dark, and in that silence, the story of Henry VI finds its ending. The narrator's voice rises softly, as if spoken from centuries away. He was a king who lost France, and with it, the faith of his people. Yet he built a realm of the spirit that no army could destroy. His fall was not born of treachery or sin, but of a heart too gentle for the crown it bore. A single candle burns to its end. The last glow fades over the marble of Windsor Chapel. A dynasty does not perish because it is defeated in war, the voice continues, but because a heart too weak to rule forgets that mercy alone cannot hold a kingdom. And so, the film of history closes on the image of stillness. A crown resting on an empty throne, a nation divided yet searching for peace, in the faint echo of a prayer that once rose from a king who sought heaven in a world made of iron.